As the Pacific War neared its climax, the skies over Formosa, now Taiwan, brimmed with tension. More than 450 Japanese aircraft lay in wait on the island's airfields, poised to defend against an inevitable American invasion. The stage was set for a decisive aerial confrontation that could alter the course of the war. But were these forces enough to stop the relentless advance of the U.S. military? Formosa stood as one of the most critical strategic locations in the Pacific theater. For the Japanese Empire, it was more than just an island. It was a crucial defensive barrier, a launchpad for operations, and a final hope to slow the relentless American advance. Positioned between Japan and the recently liberated Philippines, Formosa's network of airfields provided a staging ground for both defensive and offensive air missions. Losing it would mean exposing the Japanese home islands to direct attacks, a scenario the imperial military could not afford. As American forces pushed across the Pacific, island hopping toward their ultimate goal of reaching Japan, the importance of Formosa grew exponentially. The island's location made it an ideal base for the Japanese to launch strikes on U.S. naval fleets, disrupt supply lines, and counteract any attempt to gain control over the region. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy worked tirelessly to reinforce their air presence, assembling a formidable force of more than 450 aircraft on Formosan airstrips. Fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes were strategically positioned across multiple bases, ready to defend the island with everything they had. The buildup of aircraft was no mere coincidence. Japanese military planners understood that the next phase of the war would see the United States attempting to neutralize Formosa before advancing further. Intelligence reports indicated that a major American offensive was imminent, and defensive preparations intensified. Aircraft were dispersed across different locations to minimize the risk of losing them in a single attack. Camouflage netting concealed many of the planes from aerial reconnaissance, and ground crews worked tirelessly to ensure every aircraft was operational. Pilots trained rigorously, fully aware that they would soon be engaged in some of the most intense combat of their lives. Despite their meticulous preparations, Japanese forces faced an overwhelming challenge. The air power of the United States had proven to be superior in nearly every major engagement. American pilots were well trained, their aircraft more advanced, and their strategy relentless. While Japan had some experienced aviators, many of their best pilots had already been lost in previous battles, leaving less experienced replacements to fill their ranks. Fuel shortages and dwindling supplies further complicated the situation, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the aircraft in peak fighting condition. The Americans, well aware of Formosa's strategic importance, had no intention of allowing the Japanese to utilize their amassed air power effectively. Intelligence gathered from aerial reconnaissance and decoded communications revealed the extent of the Japanese buildup. In response, U.S. military planners devised a series of coordinated air and naval strikes aimed at crippling Formosa's airfields before Japan could launch its counteroffensive. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, one that would determine whether the island remained a formidable stronghold or a vulnerable stepping stone in the path to Japan. For Japanese commanders, the challenge was clear. They had to hold Formosa at all costs. They knew that if American bombers gained the upper hand, their carefully assembled fleet of aircraft would be destroyed before they could even take to the skies. Every available resource was poured into bolstering defenses. Anti-aircraft positions were strengthened, fighter squadrons were placed on high alert, and plans were drawn up for large-scale counterattacks. Some commanders even considered deploying kamikaze units to target incoming American carriers, a desperate but increasingly common tactic in Japan's fight for survival. The soldiers and airmen stationed on Formosa understood the gravity of the situation. Many had fought in previous battles and had seen firsthand the devastating effectiveness of American air raids. Others were young and inexperienced, thrust into the war with little choice but to fight for their homeland. There was no room for hesitation or fear. The fate of the island, and perhaps the empire itself, depended on their ability to defend against the coming storm. As the tension mounted, the island skies remained eerily quiet. The distant roar of aircraft engines was a constant reminder that the battle could begin at any moment. Ground crews made their final checks, ensuring fuel tanks were full and weapons were loaded. Pilots sat in their cockpits, waiting for the signal that would send them into combat. Officers moved between command centers, coordinating strategies and bracing for the inevitable. Then, the first reports came in. American aircraft were spotted approaching from the east. The battle for Formosa was about to begin. The distant hum of engines grew louder, turning into a thunderous roar as American aircraft approached Formosa. Japanese pilots rushed to their planes, ground crews scrambling to clear the runways for takeoff. The moment they had trained for had finally arrived. Within minutes, fighters lifted off the ground, climbing rapidly to intercept the incoming threat. The sky, once calm, now filled with the dark silhouettes of warplanes preparing for an all-out clash. As the first wave of U.S. bombers closed in, Japanese anti-aircraft guns roared to life. Explosions erupted in the air, leaving trails of smoke where shells detonated. Though the defensive fire created a deadly barrier, American pilots pressed forward, weaving through the barrage with precise maneuvers. Their mission was clear: cripple the airfields before Japan's assembled force could fully engage. Japanese fighters engaged the incoming aircraft with fierce determination. They twisted and rolled through the sky, machine guns rattling as they tried to cut down the enemy before the bombers reached their targets. Dogfights erupted across the clouds, filling the air with streaks of fire and debris. Some American bombers took hits, spiraling downward in flames, but the majority pressed on, undeterred by the resistance. The sheer number of enemy planes overwhelmed the defenders. Despite their resolve, many Japanese aircraft were shot down before they could gain an advantage. Those that managed to avoid destruction fought with everything they had, launching desperate counterattacks against the waves of incoming bombers. Some pilots resorted to ramming their aircraft into enemy planes, knowing that conventional tactics were no longer enough. On the ground, the situation grew dire. As bombs rained down, entire sections of the airfields were reduced to rubble. Explosions sent shockwaves through the island, destroying fuel depots, hangars, and parked aircraft before they could even take flight. Smoke and fire consumed the runways, making it nearly impossible for additional fighters to launch. The defenses that had taken months to build were unraveling in a matter of hours. Japanese commanders watched in horror as their air power was systematically dismantled. Communications with some squadrons went silent, lost in the chaos of battle. Desperate orders were given to reinforce key positions, but with each passing minute, the ability to mount a coordinated defense slipped further away. The airfields, once filled with the pride of Japan's remaining aerial strength, now resembled a graveyard of twisted metal and burning wreckage. Still, the surviving pilots refused to surrender. Those who had already taken off continued to fight, diving into the enemy formations with unrelenting aggression. American planes fell from the sky under the relentless assault, but the outcome was clear. There were simply too many to stop. The losses on both sides were heavy, yet the advantage belonged to the Americans, whose superior numbers and firepower steadily pushed the defenders to their limits. As the battle raged on, kamikaze units were called into action. Pilots, fully aware that they would not return, took off with the sole mission of crashing into American carriers and warships. They knew that their sacrifice was the last hope of inflicting damage that could slow the invasion. Some managed to break through the American defenses, striking their targets with devastating force, but the majority were intercepted before reaching their objectives. Even this desperate measure was not enough to turn the tide. Hours passed, and the once mighty defensive force of Formosa had been shattered. Wreckage littered the landscape, the airfields left in ruins. The skies, once filled with hundreds of Japanese planes, now belonged to the Americans. Smoke billowed from the destruction, rising like a signal of impending defeat. Those who survived retreated where they could, some disappearing into the dense jungles, others awaiting orders that would never come. The battle had been brutal, but the outcome was undeniable. Formosa's last aerial stand had failed. The path to Japan was now more vulnerable than ever, and the weight of defeat hung heavily over those who had fought so desperately to defend their position. The war was far from over, but for the defenders of Formosa, it was the beginning of the end. The destruction of Formosa's airfields marked a turning point in the battle. Fire still raged across the island as thick black smoke curled into the sky, a grim testament to the sheer force of the American assault. The once mighty fleet of Japanese aircraft had been reduced to wreckage, their remnants scattered across the landscape. Those that had managed to escape destruction were left with no place to land, forced to retreat toward the Japanese mainland or attempt emergency landings in remote areas. The defenders had fought with everything they had, but the overwhelming firepower of the enemy had proven too much to overcome. Despite the devastation, the American forces knew their mission was far from over. The destruction of the airfields was a significant victory, but there were still pockets of resistance scattered throughout the island. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries continued to fire, and remnants of the shattered air force attempted desperate counterattacks. However, their numbers had been so drastically reduced that they posed little threat to the advancing American forces. With the skies now under firm control, the next phase of the operation could begin. From the decks of aircraft carriers positioned miles offshore, additional waves of bombers and fighter escorts took to the air. Their objective was clear: eliminate any remaining resistance and ensure that Formosa could no longer serve as a launch point for enemy attacks. Precision strikes targeted military installations, supply depots, and communication hubs, severing the island's ability to coordinate defenses. With each successful attack, the stronghold that had once been so vital to the enemy crumbled further. On the ground, Japanese troops scrambled to regroup. Officers attempted to reorganize what was left of their forces, but the destruction had left them with limited options. Messages were sent to headquarters, but few received responses. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies, they understood that their ability to continue the fight was slipping away. Morale plummeted as the full weight of their losses set in. The airfields that had once been their greatest asset had now become their greatest weakness. The American forces wasted no time in pressing their advantage. With aerial superiority secured, bombers shifted their focus to key infrastructure, ensuring that Formosa would no longer be a functional military base. Bridges, fuel reserves, and weapon stockpiles were systematically destroyed. Supply lines collapsed, leaving the remaining defenders stranded and isolated. What had once been a fortress of Japanese air power was now little more than smoldering ruins. Despite the hopelessness of their situation, some defenders refused to surrender. Small groups of pilots and soldiers attempted to carry out guerrilla-style counterattacks, using whatever resources they had left. Some launched nighttime raids on enemy positions, hoping to delay the inevitable. Others took to the mountains and forests, determined to fight to the last man. Their resolve was strong, but without supplies or reinforcements, their resistance could not last long. As American reconnaissance flights swept over the island, the extent of the destruction became fully visible. Where once rows of aircraft had lined the runways, now only twisted metal and charred wreckage remained. Hangars that had once housed Japan's hopes of defending the island were little more than skeletal frames. The airfields had become symbols of a battle that had ended in disaster for the defenders. In the days that followed, the last remnants of resistance were methodically dismantled. American forces continued their relentless airstrikes, ensuring that no remaining stronghold could rise again. Reports from intelligence confirmed that Formosa was no longer a threat, marking a decisive victory in the Pacific campaign. The Japanese military, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, had suffered another devastating blow, one that would accelerate the collapse of their once formidable defenses. For the American pilots and soldiers who had taken part in the battle, the victory was significant but came at a cost. Many had lost comrades in the fierce fighting, and the sight of fallen planes, both friend and foe, served as a sobering reminder of the war's brutal reality. Yet, there was no time to dwell on the past. The path to Japan was now open, and the battle for the Pacific was far from over. As the last fires on Formosa began to fade, the island stood as a shattered remnant of what it once had been. The defenders had fought with everything they had, but in the end, their efforts had not been enough. The skies now belonged to the Americans, and with Formosa neutralized, the war would move ever closer to its final and inevitable conclusion. The once mighty airfields of Formosa lay in ruins, their runways cracked and littered with the remains of destroyed aircraft. The flames that had consumed fuel depots and ammunition stockpiles had finally begun to die down, leaving behind only smoke rising into the overcast sky. The battle was over, and the island's role as a defensive stronghold had been erased. American forces had achieved total air superiority, and with it came the grim realization for the Japanese defenders that their last line of resistance had been shattered. For those who had survived the devastation, the days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Some soldiers, left without leadership or communication, retreated into the dense jungles and mountains, hoping to evade capture and continue the fight in whatever way they could. Others remained near the ruined airfields, staring at the wreckage of what had once been their best chance at repelling the American advance. With their aircraft destroyed and supplies dwindling, many knew there was little hope of continuing the war from Formosa. American reconnaissance missions confirmed the extent of the destruction. Photographs taken from high above showed airstrips reduced to rubble, hangars collapsed, and defensive positions silenced. Intelligence officers reviewed the reports, confirming that the Japanese air power on the island had been effectively neutralized. Without its airfields, Formosa was no longer the strategic asset it had once been. The path toward the Japanese mainland was now open, and the American military turned its focus to the next phase of the war. Despite the overwhelming defeat, remnants of the Japanese forces refused to surrender. Small units moved under the cover of night, attempting to salvage whatever weapons and supplies they could find. Some took refuge in abandoned bunkers, waiting for reinforcements that would never come. For these soldiers, surrender was not an option. Their orders had been clear: hold Formosa at all costs. But now, with no planes left to defend the skies and no reinforcements to call upon, their mission had become impossible. As American bombers flew overhead on their way to new targets, the last defenders of Formosa watched in silence. They had fought with everything they had, but the reality of their situation was undeniable. Supplies were running out, communications had been severed, and their forces had been decimated. The battle had been lost, and with it, any hope of turning the tide of the war in their favor. On the American side, the victory at Formosa was a significant step toward ending the war. Military planners now shifted their focus to the next phase of the campaign, knowing that the fall of Formosa meant Japan's defensive perimeter was crumbling. Each island taken brought them closer to their ultimate objective: the invasion of the Japanese homeland. The destruction of more than 450 enemy aircraft meant that any future battles would be fought with an even greater advantage in the air. Though the battle had been won, the cost of victory was evident. Many American pilots and crew members had lost their lives in the fierce fighting. Some had gone down in flames over the island, while others had been forced to crash land in the ocean, never to be seen again. The wreckage of both Japanese and American aircraft served as a somber reminder of the brutal nature of aerial warfare. For the Japanese military, the loss of Formosa was yet another blow to an already crumbling defense. Reports of the island's destruction reached high command, and though they attempted to downplay the defeat, the truth was clear. Their ability to stop the American advance was slipping away with each battle lost. Formosa had been their last hope of delaying the inevitable, but now that hope had been reduced to ashes. As the days passed, the remnants of the Japanese forces on the island continued to dwindle. Some perished from wounds sustained in battle, others from starvation and exhaustion. A few were eventually captured, their war ending not with a final act of defiance, but in surrender to an enemy that had proven too powerful to resist. The once defiant defenders of Formosa had been left with nothing but memories of the battle that had sealed their fate. With Formosa no longer a threat, American forces pressed forward. The battle for the Pacific was nearing its final chapter, and Japan's ability to resist was fading. The skies that had once been filled with the roar of Japanese warplanes now belonged to the Americans, and with each passing day, the war moved closer to its ultimate conclusion. The island lay in silence, its once thriving airfields now nothing more than charred ruins. The fires that had consumed the remnants of Japan's air power had long since burned out, leaving behind a landscape of twisted metal and shattered runways. Smoke still drifted through the air, carried by the wind as a final reminder of the battle that had been lost. The defenders of Formosa, once so determined to hold their ground, had been scattered, some killed in combat, others lost in the vast wilderness, clinging to whatever scraps of hope remained. But the war would not wait for them. It moved forward, relentless and unforgiving, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. For those who had survived, there was no sense of victory, only the weight of what had been lost. The American forces had secured their objective, eliminating the threat of Japanese air power on the island and paving the way for the next phase of their campaign. Yet, as they looked out over the wreckage, there was little cause for celebration. The price of war was written in every ruined aircraft, in every crater that scarred the land, in the silent remains of those who had fought with everything they had. The battle for Formosa had ended, but the war itself was far from over. Somewhere in the jungle, a lone Japanese pilot moved carefully through the thick undergrowth, his uniform torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He had managed to escape the bombardment, but there was nowhere left to go. His plane had been destroyed, his squadron wiped out. He had no orders, no radio, no hope of reinforcements. Yet he kept moving, driven by instinct rather than reason. Surrender was unthinkable, but so was survival. He was caught between two fates, neither offering a path forward. Across the island, small pockets of resistance still clung to life, refusing to accept defeat. Some dug into the mountains, waiting for reinforcements that would never come. Others, too wounded to fight, lay hidden in the ruins, their bodies broken, but their spirits unwilling to yield. They had been told that to fall into enemy hands was worse than death, that honor demanded they fight to the last man. And so they waited, even as the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. On the American side, the mission had been a success. Reports confirmed that Formosa was no longer a viable military stronghold. The destruction of its airfields meant that Japan had lost another critical piece of its defense, another step closer to inevitable defeat. But even as the news of victory spread through the ranks, there was little time to dwell on it. Orders had already been issued, new targets identified, new battles waiting to be fought. The war machine pressed on unstoppable, its momentum carrying it ever closer to the final confrontation. For the people of Formosa, the battle had been a nightmare from which there was no escape. The skies had been filled with fire, the ground shaken by endless waves of destruction. Homes had been lost, families shattered, lives changed forever. They had watched as their island was torn apart by forces far beyond their control, powerless to stop the devastation. Now they faced an uncertain future, caught between two warring nations with no say in the conflict that had consumed their land. As the days passed, the island grew quieter. The echoes of war faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. The wreckage remained, a testament to the battle that had raged across the skies, but the men who had fought it were gone, some moving on to new battlefields, others left behind, buried beneath the ruins of their final stand. The war had no time for the dead. It marched forward, indifferent to those it left in its wake. The pilot in the jungle stopped beneath the twisted remains of a tree, his breath shallow, his strength nearly gone. He looked up at the sky, once filled with the roar of engines, now empty and vast. He knew that soon the Americans would come, sweeping through the island, hunting for the last remnants of resistance. He had no weapon, no supplies, nothing left but the memories of a battle that had already been decided. For a moment, he considered surrender, the thought creeping into his mind like a shadow. But then, just as quickly, he pushed it away. He had made his choice long ago. He would not surrender. Far above, American bombers flew toward their next target, their engines humming as they carried the war ever closer to its conclusion. Formosa had fallen, but the end was still beyond the horizon. More battles would be fought, more lives lost, more cities reduced to ash. And when it was over, when the final bombs had fallen, and the last shots had been fired, what would remain? Would victory erase the scars left behind? Would the world ever be the same? The war had begun with fire, and it would end the same way. Until then, there was only one certainty. There would be no turning back.